There are a handful of universities around the country that are conducting clinical research into psychedelics and the potential healing benefit it has for patients of trauma. But now, Harvard University is stepping into the fray, this time studying psychedelics and law.
The research will focus on 5 areas: ethics in psychedelics research and therapeutics, challenges with psychedelics and intellectual property law, federal support for psychedelics research, access to and equity in emerging psychedelics industries, and the role of psychedelics in healing and in trauma.
This comes as decriminalization gains steam across the country. And it's interesting and maybe appropriate that Harvard is finally stepping into this, because in a lot of ways, the original movement kind of launched out of there with Timothy Leary kind of conducting experiments there and then leaving and then kind of evangelizing psychedelics throughout the 60s, leading to the backlash and the crackdown. Since then, you were telling us before we started that you like to microdose before each show so that you're kind of at the right level. With the problem with microdosing, of course, if you get the dose wrong,
right,
all of a sudden it's a very different morning.
Imagine if you accidentally macrodosed through Rising.
It could certainly happen.
The teleprompter is a different ballgame when you're microdosing.
It certainly is. Are there 3 of these or not? But seriously though, both MDMA and psilocybin at this point are now broadly accepted to have therapeutic value, particularly for people who are suffering with PTSD. Where is the right on psychedelics and at least allowing them to enter in through the medical space?
So you literally wrote the book on this, if I'm not mistaken.
One of them.
Right?
One of them. That's right.
And what's been interesting to watch is how this has started to unfold as a medical conversation. And that, I think, is important in terms of convincing skeptics and people who need to actually be persuaded that this can be done safely and that this can be done in a way that is medically advantageous to people. The stories of success from MDMA in treating PTSD, for instance, are incredible, and they're incredibly moving. And when you see them sort of done in a medical context, I think that's a lot more persuasive to people. And as that research advances and as that progress continues, that's a very powerful thing. That's been a very powerful thing, I think, for people to watch, and it sort of divorces the debate from the cartoonish characteristics that it may have previously had.
Well, yeah, and psychedelics really became a proxy for the counterculture war in the 1960s. That Nixon and others kind of identified acid in particular, but also marijuana, which is not a psychedelic, but they lumped it in there, as examples of the way that the counterculture was getting out of control, and if the silent majority was going to retake its rightful place as running this country, that you would have to go to war on drugs. He actually picked it up from Democrats, but labeled Democrats as the party of acid, abortion, and amnesty. That was their kind of alliteration that they were trying to stick the party with, and so Democrats, as a result, as they did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, with everything else, we're like, oh no, you think you're drug warriors? We're the drug warriors. Joe Biden actually was a sponsor of the RAVE Act, which in the early 2000s, basically, if you had a party in a barn and cops decided it was a rave, they could lock everybody up for like extremely long stretches of time. One of the most unconstitutional, vicious, and brutal laws that has been passed. Do you see this actually changing, though? Do you think that we're at a place that there isn't the same fear of a counterculture? Because the counterculture is kind of gone. We just have like a culture.
Yeah.
Now the hippies, there's still some hippies here and there, but they're not being elevated to threat level by even Donald Trump. Donald Trump, he'll flag Antifa. Antifa doesn't have anything to do with psychedelics. So does that create political space for us to talk about this in a rational way, finally?
Well, and remember, my generation and even people younger are doing drugs at much lower rates. It's a much more risk averse.
Why is that? So my book was 2009, and my theory was because people were spending so much time online, young people were, that in order to get high with your friends, you have to be somewhere.
100%. I mean, and there's always something to do now, even if it's, seems like it's doing nothing, but there's always stimulus on the internet. There's always something to do. There's always, you don't have 3 channels anymore. You don't have to go to Blockbuster or Hollywood Video. You can just sit and you can binge watch Game of Thrones, and then when you're done with that, you have 100 other similar shows that you can get through. So I definitely think that's part of it, and that's an enormous conversation. But what happened with marijuana was, the medicinal value of marijuana, as that was sort of exhibited to the public, that was what changed public opinion on marijuana. And I think that's what really obviously opened up the gateways to legalization and decriminalization. And so I think the more people see things like MDMA in that context, in a medical context and in a successful medical context, the more easy it'll be for some of these measures to pass.
And the opioid crisis is getting so bad that I think it's going to create more space in our politics and in our culture for more creative solutions to it. Like for the last 50 years, the answer to anybody's substance abuse issue was basically go to AA. Read the big book, take it a day at a time, complete sobriety, complete abstinence. That has been proven when it comes to opioids to be utterly ineffective. Some people, obviously, it's going to work for, but compared to other treatment approaches, medication-assisted treatment, for instance, it's not at all effective. It gets harder, though, for people to say, well, what about ibogaine? Or what about ayahuasca? Or what about psilocybin? But when you have people dying at higher rates in some states than of coronavirus, of dying of opioid overdoses, at some point families are going to be searching out treatments and say, oh wait, so ibogaine has worked for this number of people to break addiction. And people talk about the way it kind of resets your brain. And we have so much trauma in this country and so much misery that it feels like we can't afford anymore to refuse to look at these types of solutions.
So in that broader context, do you worry, as a proponent of legalization via certain methods or avenues, do you worry that given the amount of misery and pain in this country, that would sort of that would sort of throttle us further into this artificial or this the culture of numbness? I don't, for this reason. For one, because psychedelics are spiritual. They're like anti-numbing. Like Houston Smith has written about this. So his famous book was in the first edition was called The Religions of Man. He then came out with an updated version and with a new politically correct title, which was, I think, The World's Religions. And in that one, he includes an appendix or like a new final chapter where he compares psychedelics and a psychedelic journey to the spiritual journeys in all of these different world's religions. And so, one of the greatest 20th century scholars of religion, Houston Smith, made a very persuasive and academic case that actually these experiences are quite similar to these universal transcendental experiences that people have had over millennia. So on that front, it doesn't lead to numbing. It actually goes the opposite direction. It kind of wakes people up. It stimulates the brain.
Right, but the other key point is it's kind of anti-abusive in a way, in the sense that if you take a hit of acid on a Monday, in order to trip again on Tuesday, you would need, say, 3 doses of acid. Wednesday, there's not enough acid in the world that could make you trip. And that also explains why there's no commercial market for it. Why you don't have Mexican cartels or out making it in mass and trying to pump it into the system, because for a market to flourish, you have to be able to continue to sell to people. There's no kind of incentive for anybody to create something that just makes the world a better place and that somebody uses once a year or once every 10 years and pays $5 for it. That's not a decent, profitable business. And so the fact that it just simply stops working, and mushrooms are the same way, that you could try to shroom all week long, but by Thursday, you're not going to feel anything at all. And it's not like you can take an extra amount. It's just your brain is like, no, we get this, and we don't feel like melting down anymore today.
When did you write this book?
So I wrote it published it in 2009 when the war on drugs was still raging.
Right.
It's stunning how much has changed.
It's an amazing cover.
12 years since then. Yeah, I don't know if you remember that, but in the 80s there was this famous "Say No to Drugs" ad.
Right. And
maybe it's so iconic that people still remember it. I'm curious if you do, where there was a frying egg in the pan and say, "This is your brain."
Yeah.
They turn the pan on. This is your brain on drugs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I can't. Yeah. So from 2009 until now, the way this has evolved, it just has to be night and day.
Yeah, it was the book, obviously. People,
Ryan gets results.
yeah. And it was magic because nobody really read the books, but somehow it still changed the culture anyway.
Osmosis.
Yeah,
It was in
yes,
the universe, and then it just sort of
Yep.
got into everybody's brain.
Totally trippy. So tomorrow, Rachel Bovard and Jennifer Holdsworth Karp join us for Team Rising.
And we'll weigh in on the latest news of the day. Now that you know we're microdosing, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we will see you back here tomorrow.